Hi, I'm Lori Gehring, and I'm the climate change news editor at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where climate change has been at the core of our work for about a decade and a half now. Like my colleague Megan Rowling, who you just heard from earlier, I'm just back from the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow, where net zero conversations were everywhere and a key backbone of climate action. And so for the next hour, we're going to be talking about achieving net zero, the world's next moonshot. First, we're going to watch a short video, and then we'll come back to the conversation.
The idea of zero emissions is pretty straightforward. You just stop producing the emissions that cause climate change, right? Reducing some emissions is of course doable, but it's getting to the zero part that's quite tricky. So instead of a zero goal, a lot of people are opting for a net zero goal instead. This means you balance out the emissions you can't get rid of yourself through investing in other projects or initiatives that can reduce those emissions for you. This is also known as offsetting. So you could invest in solar panels or wind turbines in poorer countries, for example. Or you could pay to support new clean green technology like green hydrogen fuel. Then a lot of other tech falls under this category called carbon capture and storage. Emissions are pulled from the air or from power plants and pumped into storage underground in old oil wells or other structures. With direct air capture, machines suck carbon from the air and then it's buried underground or turned into something like material for building roads. One last idea is something called BECCS, which stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Large parts of the planet would be covered in trees and shrubs and grasses, and then these would then be burned for energy in power plants with the emissions stored underground. As it stands, it doesn't cost anyone to emit these climate-changing emissions. This means if companies don't have a strong incentive to cut back on their emissions, they're not really going to do so beyond their own voluntary pledges. But in reality, any net zero pledge is actually quite simple. Governments, businesses, and of course all of us need to stick to our word and cut back our emissions first. Offsets should be used just to clean up the trickle that's left behind. And we have to start now.
The challenge of heading off the worst impacts of climate change is now an enormous one, after decades of putting off the need to cut emissions, which are still rising. Scientists say by 2030, which is now less than a decade away, global emissions need to fall by nearly half, something that would be globally unprecedented. So how do we do that? In the last few years, we've had 135 countries, 111 regions, 230 big cities, and more than 640 companies sign voluntary pledges to reach net zero emissions by 2050. These pledges now cover nearly 90% of global emissions. Meeting these will require companies, countries, and cities to either eliminate their climate-changing emissions or offset a share of them through things like investing in protecting or planting forests that absorb carbon dioxide, or in more kind of sci-fi emerging ideas like sucking carbon out of the air and storing it permanently underground. Investors will also need to move their money into investments that support these changes. So with this many pledges, it's problem solved, right? Well, not exactly. As we found out the hard way in the climate world, pledges aren't always met. Greta Thunberg thinks net zero is more blah, 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 a license for companies to keep polluting and use dodgy offsets. Indigenous forest communities fear losses to their land to offsetting projects. And plenty of people worry that in the rush to cut emissions, the poor could be left behind and out of work. So, what makes a good net zero emissions plan? Will they achieve the emission reductions that we need in time? And how do we bring people with us as we try to make this really enormous shift? Today, I have with me some great frontline experts in this push. We have Ma Jun, who's director of China's influential Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, in the country that's today the world's biggest emitter of climate-changing emissions. We have Adrian Calcroft, Vice President of Amazon's Sustainability Architecture, which has promised, company has promised to reach net zero emissions by 2040. That's a decade ahead of many others and ahead of the Paris Agreement, but it still has emissions rising as it grows. We have Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, the mayor of Freetown, which is the capital of Sierra Leone, where net zero is pretty much as much about a fair deal for people and a just recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic as about emissions reductions. And finally, we have Travis Antoniono, investment manager for climate strategy with the California Public Employees Retirement System, which manages investments of hundreds of billions of dollars, big enough to have an influence on the broader investment ecosystem. So I'd like to just launch into the first round of questions. Ma, could I ask you first, China has said it's going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. How does it intend to do that? And what are the challenges in the way?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And as you said, China is the, we have 1.4 billion people, still fast growing economy, and is responsible for the largest current greenhouse gas emission in the world. And in 2020, China has made a solemn pledge to cut its to be carbon neutral before 2030, and then pick our carbon emission before 2030, and then be carbon neutral by 2060. And of course, it will be a process first, to pick. China is still growing, so unlike many Western countries which have naturally picked, China need to artificially push the peak ahead of the schedule, and with a much lower peak volume. And we have managed to make some progress thanks to the massive Clean Air Action Plan. China's vast expansion of coal consumption has been tracked. Before that plan was initiated 8 years ago, China's coal consumption tripled in just 12 years of time. But ever since then, it's stagnated. But still, we are having now a emission of slightly more than 10 billion metric tons that we need to pick, and then we're gonna expect to have some plateau period by 2035, and then from 2035, we have to go through a very sharp decrease. So this is going to be the shortest time span between picking and completely neutrality. So how to do that? Before 2030, the focus is going to be on carbon dioxide. It will be focused on energy-related emission, which is 90% of all these sources of the of carbon emission. And of course, coal, among that, coal account for 80% of that. So how to pick our coal first, over the next several years, and then in the second half of this decade, then try to decrease that. I think that's quite crucial. And then some of the leading industries like iron steel, like cement, which massive emitters. China's steel manufacturing account for 60%, nearly 60% of the global total, with a vast carbon emission. So how to pick that? Pick that probably it's easier, but how to completely neutralize that? There are a lot of technologies and solutions still not quite clear. I have to say the path on some of the industries still not all clear. So a lot of development need to be made, and this ongoing, energy crisis plus the power shortage, power outage have actually taught us also a very hard lesson that the intermittent nature of the renewables. Despite all this massive, enormous investment on that to boost the capacity, and then try to build all this new energy vehicles, when still the base load, we haven't been able to find alternatives other than the fossil fuel. So we now have to release a lot of coal capacity again, just like what happened in America, in Europe, and in some other major economies. So we're facing the headwind, but still I trust that there are chances to do that, because as an organization, we have witnessed how China managed to cut our air pollution, in just 8 years of time. That's about roughly the time, as Lori put it, that the world need to cut our carbon emission if we want to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive. So I think we need to, but we do need to work together. Everyone need to come together on that. Thank you.
Yeah, that really makes clear the giant scale of what needs to happen and the speed, but also that it is possible actually to achieve some of these pretty remarkable things quickly if everything's heading in the right direction. And speaking of scale, Adrian, Amazon's promised to reach net zero emissions across its operations by 2040. And to run on 100% clean energy by 2025. How are you trying to do that? And what are the challenges you're facing?
Yeah, 2050 the Paris Agreement is really quite a long way out. So one of the things that we decided to do was to take that's basically the same commitment, but bring a net zero commitment that's 10 years earlier. And then we created the climate pledge. And it's not just Amazon. We've now got over 200 pledge signatories that have signed up for this and made this commitment. And it includes people like Procter & Gamble, Visa, PepsiCo, Verizon, Siemens, Microsoft, IBM, Salesforce. Combined, this adds up to 1.8 trillion in global annual revenues. It's more than 7 million employees. And the pledge added together is almost 2 billion metric tons from a 2020 baseline, 5.4% of current global emissions. So the more people we can get into the pledge, this is sort of biasing the ability for the world to get to a 2050 Paris Agreement. If we can get more and more of the large industrial companies and to have an earlier commitment, it helps bring it in earlier. We want to bend the curve down earlier rather than going late and then trying to get it down at the last minute. So that's part of our commitment. We have other funds that we've been investing in both startups and in nature-based solutions. And as you mentioned, we're on this path to powering operations with 100% renewable energy by 2025. So breaking down the targets, we've got targets for 2025, 2020, and 2030 that bring short-term planning can actually do something with. The 2040, 2050 goals are really too far out for people to work against. Most people are going to be retired, not in the same job by the time you have to deliver. So you have to have something that's real. We've been aggressively investing in power purchase agreements. Our strategy is to put the bulk of our investment in actual energy and decarbonization projects, and to have a much smaller investment, smaller and later investment in offsets and things like that. So we're really trying to concentrate on decarbonizing the business. So we've got currently Amazon's the largest corporate buyer of renewable energy globally in the US and in Europe. So we have over 10 gigawatts total, over 2.5 gigawatts in Europe. That's 85 utility scale wind and solar projects. And we've been announcing these at a very rapid pace over the last year or two. Problem with these, of course, you announce it and then it takes a year or two to build in most cases. So we're still rolling out a large amount of this capacity, and that's helping bring our predict. So we can see a fairly clear path for how we're going to get to 2025 by looking at the investments we're making really in the next year or two. And then that's sort of the electricity side. And then if we look at what most people think of Amazon as, most of the interactions is, packages get delivered to your house. That's kind of one of the large population of people around the world that use Amazon as a retail and delivery capability. We're transforming our transportation network around the world by electrifying it. This, of course, is creating even more electricity demand. So we're having to buy ahead to get into the electricity we're going to need to run basically an electric delivery fleet. We ordered 100,000 custom electric delivery vehicles from Rivian, who had their IPO just recently. Very successful. It all seems to be going very well for them, at least from the IPO point of view. And they're delivering the first few vehicles this year, 10,000 next year, and we have 100,000 on order. We also ordered 1,800 electric delivery vehicles in Europe from Mercedes-Benz, and in India, we're going to be deploying 10,000 electric rickshaws by 2025. So that's some of the things we're doing. There's obviously a lot more. And the challenge for Amazon is that we've been growing very fast as a company, and it's been hard for us to, and these projects take a while to mature. So we're kind of in that phase now where the growth rate is still driving our overall carbon footprint up, but we've been we're laying down the foundation to turn that down, and as we invest in electric delivery and decarbonizing our electricity supply globally.
Okay, so that's so one of your challenges is basically getting this all scaled up and working fast enough. Especially, I know there's been a lot made that Amazon's emissions have risen in the last couple of years, pretty substantially. In part because in lockdown lots of us were ordering Amazon packages. So trying to achieve these things really quickly while growing the business is clearly a challenge. And I liked your comment about how the people making these decisions won't be around. They'll be retired by 2050. I think that's true of politicians too. I was hearing at COP26 this new term I hadn't heard before, which is not in my term of office, NIM2. And Yvonne, I think that brings us to you. This is a problem facing both corporate people and politicians. Trying to get this all done quickly in the term of office and keeping whether it's shareholders or voters happy. Freetown already has quite low emissions, but it needs to hold down the growth in emissions while it develops and creates a better life for people. What does achieving this net zero aim look like in your job, and how are you going about it?
Thanks so much, Laurie, and it's great to be here. I actually want to pick up on something Adrian said before I come in to answer your question directly, and it sort of sets a bit of a context. So Adrian just talked about Amazon requiring, or maybe actually already utilize, I'm not sure if I got it right, 10 gigs of power. And I want to just point out that Sub-Saharan Africa currently is using or has at its disposal 81 gigawatts of power. That's 48 countries in comparison to a corporate. And therein lies a very interesting element of the climate change debate, which often gets sort of glossed over. The absolute range, diversity in the experiences of various countries and cities. And the need for us in discussing net zero to appreciate that there still has to be growth, and also to appreciate that there is already an imbalance. So what does net zero mean for my city? We are a teeny weeny emitter. And without the investments, emissions come from money. Whether it's, having the luxury of being able to have Amazon boxes delivered to your home and increase the emissions of Amazon and yourself, or whether it's being able to invest in the adaptation technologies which are so desperately required, where climate change impacts are already being experienced and resulting in sea level rising, resulting in flooding, extreme heat, and the consequences of these. So requiring moving of infrastructure, requiring investing in renewable energy so that you have an energy base. But in our position, I want to come back to that 81 gigawatts and the teeny amounts that are available in my country and in my city, the need for there to be a transition where there is still investment in infrastructure, in energy sources. I will definitely, not be advocating for coal or diesel, but there's still a space for gas. So I'm bringing this to the table to say net zero, you mentioned, Laura, in your introduction, that offsets need to be seen as the absolute last. But in reality, because our situations are different and we're in different places in the growth trajectory, in some cases, there still needs to be, and that's what Maz just kind of explained, that China will be doing going on to 2030. And the deficits, the energy deficit and the growth difference, development difference is so stark that there needs to be an acceptance, but there also needs to be finance going into this, so that as we move through climate change and this transition, we are not continuing to increase the scale of the inequalities around the globe. Because I say repeatedly that there's no getting away from the impact of climate change. There will be no one left behind, because climate migration is a reality. At the minute, it's very much internal within countries, within continents, and my cities are real sort of experiencing that, suffering from that. If I could add, huge increase in our population, we've almost doubled in 25 years, and real pressure. But the investments that we need for adaptation are investments that require money, but they're not investments that are going to give nice returns to private sector investors. So the money isn't coming. And if it doesn't come and we don't have that adaptation, we create other social, political sort of challenges which will spill over. So coming back to your question, and knowing that I've done my 3 minutes, coming back to your question, what do I see as net zero? We're investing in 1 million trees. We have just literally in the last 2 days planted the last of 550,000 trees, including 60,000 mangroves. And that's the next rainy season will see us do another 450,000. That's 3,000 hectares and 78,000 tons of carbon sequestered through that. And they will need to be not just planted, but protected so that they grow. So we're doing the offset. We're also, in terms of reducing, we are introducing sanitary landfills, which from a West perspective is like nothing, but it actually is huge, from open dumping, and also trying to introduce a cable car. I'm going to stop here. There's so much more I could say about the challenges of accessing finance to actually make these things a reality, but I will stop.
Thank you so much. I mean, obviously, this point you make is a really serious one. These impacts, we often kind of talk about the kind of first line impacts, which are the severe weather that we're seeing, really in almost everywhere around the world now. But these kind of second line impacts too, what that means when people can't grow a crop or have a job or survive in places that are too hot, too flooded, where the land disappears. These are going to be serious things that we have to deal with. This is not a theoretical discussion about net zero and zero. This is a very real one for everyone. And your point as well about the carbon budget. I mean, there's a very thin slice of the carbon budget left after the rich world has eaten up a good bit of the pie, and how that last bit gets used clearly needs to be around helping the countries that still need development to manage to do that. I'm not sure we're achieving that or committing to that yet, but clearly that needs to be a goal. Travis, I wanted to ask you, what does net zero look like from an investment perspective? How close or far away are investors from achieving that goal now? What are you doing?
Yeah, great to be here today, and I thank everyone, and I think opportunity to join the fellow accomplished panelists as well. Many of their comments that I can't help but just agree with and shake my head. Yes. So to start it off, as a roughly $500 billion investor, largest pension system in the United States, representing the pensions of about 2 million different members across California. We're very much global. We're very much represented across all marketplaces and across a very diversified portfolio, which includes many different asset classes. And with that said, the larger you are, the more diversified you are, the more global you are, the harder it is to be able to pull the levers to dramatically decrease emissions overnight. It's just not feasible. Essentially, you have to be projecting yourself over more of a longer time period and understanding the dynamics that are much more complex, much more nuanced, and what's actually going to be shifting. I think the last panelists, I couldn't help but really identify with what was mentioned, because just transition is going to be so important within this within the evolution of the world going towards more of a lower carbon society. With that said, I mean, if you look at demographic type of changes, Nigeria is projected to be the second largest population in the world. So it's not only about adaptation. It's not only about investing in new climate solutions. It's also identifying where different countries, where different populations really are, and what we can do together to be able to get the world to the next place. Because ultimately, the way that we look at this is that the more diversified you are, you will be able to relatively easy over the next 10 plus years be able to reduce your emissions profile by 50% from an intensity perspective. The next 50%, is going to be a lot more difficult. So the so-called saying, you can run, but you can't hide. I think you can run from the first 50%, but it's going to be very difficult to hide from the next 50%. There's going to be structural changes that really need to be taking place, both from investors, from politicians, from governments, and ultimately from the individual consumers, for us to really be able to see these things, come about. From that type of perspective, out of COP26, we have projections anywhere from 1.8 degrees Celsius to 2.4 degrees Celsius, depending on who you're asking, coming from the new targets that have been set. Very encouraging, but still, a ways to go. As far as what we are doing for our actions, I think we really rely on three different pillars to be able to move the needle forward, and that's advocacy. Engaging with different investors, our GPs that we interact with. Advocacy, engaging with regulators, policymakers, everything from price on carbon to regulations related to methane emissions, which we've seen progress during the last couple of weeks, which is great to see. On the integration side, it is more engaging those GPs. It's developing projects such as what's called an ESG data convergence project, which is going to be hopefully revolutionizing, really the private markets, specifically private equity, which we've now seen about 200 different GPs and LPs take interest in developing 6 different core metrics to be able to report onto. With greenhouse gas emissions being one of them, net jobs being another, diversity being another, and having those underlying portfolios actually report out to that. So the fact that they're actually just going to even measure these type of things is now going to get more attention from management to actually have a shift in direction, which hopefully is going to be a lot better for us as investors and ultimately all of us as a society. And the last thing is engagement, and Climate Action 100 Plus, which I'm sure many different investors that might be listening are very well aware of. But for those that aren't, it's essentially an engagement across 600 different investors, representing $60 trillion of assets under management, engaging about 167 of the largest different emitters across the world. There has been progress already. Bloomberg Energy Finances recently showed that about 111 of these companies have already committed to a carbon neutral or a net zero target by 2050. So it is encouraging to actually see this type of progress. And albeit that is targets, we still have the hard part to go, which is actually reducing emissions from intensity perspective and then ultimately from an absolute perspective. But if these targets are realized from these companies, that would actually represent about 25% of the global emissions. And then lastly, as far as what you can see from different investors, what is happening is that there are structural changes that can actually take place from an asset allocation type of perspective, both at the security selection, an individual investment, but also from more of a strategic perspective. How much do you allocate to different types of investments? And something that is great to share is just yesterday, we did have some encouraging progress on the asset allocation changes at CalPERS, where we will be shifting more money actually to private equity, away from public equity. Our public equity standpoint is about 90% passive. For most of the time, passive investments in the public equity domain is actually more carbon intensive than what we're seeing from a lot of the private equity. Because most private equity has shifted, from what it might have been in the 80s or 90s, more towards service-oriented type of businesses, technology type of businesses that do have a little bit of a lower carbon emissions profile. Additionally, we'll also be increasing our exposure to real assets. Our real assets exposure, includes renewables. It includes, green certified buildings. So over time, we will be seeing actual material differences in our portfolio as well. And I think these same things are also being seen across the largest investors across the globe.
Okay, thanks. Now, what's interesting in that is the turning the pledges into real action, and the measuring. You said, really figuring out if this is working, and I think that leads us really well into this next round of questions, where I wanted to ask, just starting with Ma. You said you see accountability systems as crucial to achieving these net zero goals. What do those need to look like? And do you think that countries, companies, and others who have made these pledges can be effectively held to account for them, particularly given they're voluntary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely we need an accountability system, because now, more than, as you said, more than 130 countries and regions have made their pledge, and more than 600 companies have made net zero carbon emission pledge, and now the investors are joining. So, but how in reality, we don't want Greta next time to see it's just again just a blah blah blah, and so we need an accountability system, and we do have some experience with that. In China, we continue to promote the transparency of the environmental data, and then based on the monitoring, and we managed to build a what we call the Blue Map database with a website, with an app. So on the digital map, color code all these regions, and based on their environmental quality, the rivers and lakes, and also air quality, and also 7 million companies. We located them on the digital map, color code them based on their environmental performance. Sometimes 50,000 of them real time. They have online monitoring and report to the public every hour or every 2 hours. So this is the way for us to create a local emission accountability and to manage to cut our emission, on air, on water successfully. But now it's time to tap that, on the carbon issue. And as it's a global challenge, so we started with a global map. Now on our website, you can check a global map with all these countries' emission data over there, and the pledge they made. And then we have to drill in big countries like China. We need to drill down to the local regions. This afternoon, I was in a panel with the representatives from 3 provinces, and one of them have 1 billion metric tons of carbon emission, and the other one is close to 800 million, and basically, very similar to the German country emission. And then the other one is a slightly larger emission than UK. It's just 3 of our provinces, of course, 3 large emitters. So so we allow people to check about their emission, year by year, and on carbon and on coal, on electricity, and based on this data, working with Chinese Academy of Environmental Science, developed the first regional carbon peak and neutrality index to assess their local climate ambition, and also how much their performance is on low carbon, and also the trend of decarbonization in all these different or major provinces and more than 100 cities in China. Hope to create a regional accountability to drill down, to basically distribute all our national ambition down to the regions, and then need to be done to the industries and to the major emitters, and some of them have very large volume. And one of the large aluminum manufacturer have 100 million tons of carbon emissions. So how to build accountability there? We also developed another index called Corporate Climate Action Index, and use that to assess the performance of all these companies. And some of them started measure and report. That's the very basic. And only a few of them put together have reached 1.45 billion tons of carbon. So all this are the ways, we can help people visualize through data, through mapping technology to visualize that. I hope that eventually this can be more regional or even global, provide some sort of a progress bar, year on year based on the MRV, measure, report, and verification and credible MRV, and then hold everyone, accountable. And many of them still haven't really translated their action into their supply chain in China. So I think there's a lot to be done on that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you've had these very interesting successes in kind of driving public pressure to clean up air and water, and it's so much harder, isn't it, with carbon pollution, which is something that you don't see, and that has a global participation in the pollution, not only local. So it is very interesting. It's a different animal, but having public pressure for accountability and public ability to track what's going on is really key in all of this. Adrian, I wanted to ask you, clearly making net zero work is going to require companies to cut most of their emissions themselves and offset the parts that they can't, which you mentioned. What do you think Amazon's balance of this kind of net versus zero emissions is? And how do you think you and others are doing on that? There's always criticism that it's more net than zero for many companies.
Yeah, well, I think we're much more biased towards the zero than the net to start with. That is the principle that we've been operating on for quite a while. And really, this is enshrined in the climate pledge itself. So there's three principles in the climate pledge. The first is to measure and report greenhouse gas emissions on a regular basis. And we're now several years into our annual report. The second principle is to implement decarbonization strategies in line with the Paris Agreement through real business changes and innovations. So that's energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy, materials reductions, and other carbon elimination strategies. So that's an entire principle. That's the zero part, right? And then the final principle is neutralize any remaining emissions with additional quantifiable, real, permanent, and socially beneficial offsets to achieve net zero. So the net part is the third principle, and the way to approach this is to do the zero first, and then anything that you really can't get to, we deal with the offsets. So we've set a very high quality bar for offsets, and one of the problems we found is it's hard to find credible offsets. And so we worked to create a coalition called the LEAF Coalition, which stands for Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance. And at COP recently, we announced it a little while ago, and at COP recently, there was a good progress update. We've mobilized $1 billion in financing. It's a public-private effort between governments and businesses to protect tropical forests, in particular around the world. And we started off focused, the initial announcement was largely focused on the Amazon rainforest, but the more recent announcement, there are rainforests around the world in Africa and Asia. So it's on track to be one of the largest ever public-private efforts. And we think we're going to get several $1 billion into this to provide support for countries protecting their tropical forests. And we have a large science team at Amazon who are very careful to make sure this is really scientifically as strong as we can make it, and very high quality in terms of the offsets we're doing. But like I said, if we have $100 million to invest, we're more likely to be investing it in a power purchase agreement to get another wind farm going than to buying 100 million of offsets, which would make our numbers look good in the short term, but it doesn't invest in the long term. So we are definitely biasing our investments towards the zero side of things.
When you get to 2030, what do you think the percentages will be on net versus zero?
I don't think we have a particular goal on that. By 2030, by 2025, we should be at, all our electricity should be at basically a net zero by 2025. So we will have basically clean energy by that point. We're also 2030, I think we have the goal is to have half of our deliveries be basically zero. So, there's a bunch of progress things that we're going along the way. It's challenging. It's particularly challenging. I mean, last year during COVID, we got a kind of a tailwind on these things. Now we've got more of a headwind with all of the supply chain crunch, and we're running an airline, we're running global deliveries. There's quite a few things happening. But I think the other thing that was announced last week was the Net Movers Coalition, which involves shipping and trying to get to some large organizations working on some real programs to get to decarbonize. So I think, like I said, we're really by 2030 we're really still focusing on the zero part, and it's really only as we get towards 2040 that we'll be. But if we don't invest in the availability of offsets, like through things like the Leaf Coalition, then they won't be there if we get to it in the last minute and need it. Right. So there's some element that you have to start developing a market for offsets that's going to be big enough and high quality enough that it's there when we want to dip into it. So we're kind of trying to balance between developing the market, but putting most of our investments in actual emission reduction.
Okay, thanks. Yvonne, what should a just or a fair push for net emissions globally look like? What are the key elements of that?
I think a key element is going to be the ability for countries to continue our growth trajectory. And I think it's also important for us to just continue to recognize the differences I made mention of earlier. The fact that we've got commitments for funding to come into countries where there isn't the resilience. I made that comparison with the energy deficit, but there are other comparisons which are really important. So this summer saw climate impact all over Europe. There were the floods in Germany, the fires in Greece, the floods in London. But the ability for countries and cities to recover quickly was there, in contrast to the impact on individuals as well as government in Bangladesh, in Sudan, in Uganda, which also saw massive floods. So when we talk about having a just recovery, it's got to be a recognition, or not a just recovery indeed, but a just transition, a just execution of climate action. It's got to have, there has to be this recognition of where everyone is required because of those different places. I used the example at COP. I was sitting next to a mayor, the London mayor, and I said, look, if I'm going along the motorway and my bicycle, and Mayor Khan is in his very expensive limousine, he knocks me over. My bicycle is completely destroyed. His car has some damage. No one expects me to pay for bicycle and pay for his car. We actually expect there to be insurance that he's because of what he's driving. And I sort of want to use that as a bit of an analogy for where we are today with this climate experience, where the bicycle riders who've not yet graduated to a car are being asked to fix their bicycle and to some degree pay for the damage to the car, because it's kind of like if you keep on emitting, and the finance doesn't come. This comes back to something we talked about earlier, and Travis was talking about how the funding, $500 million. I wrote it down, and I think we need to see. It didn't work at COP with no commitments for that sort of move of capital from industrialized countries into emerging economies. No commitment for it. I'm still very waffly talk about this 100 billion. a year by 2025, which again, no meat to that. And so it didn't happen in the last 5 years. Really, really concerned about any chance of it happening as we go forward. So the bicycle remains damaged, and the consequences are that, I think I was in the conversation I was in this morning, I was in another panel where someone spoke about the moral obligation of the limousine rider towards the bicycle, the cyclist. And I'll just say that that's what just looks like to me. There has got to be funding made so that repairs can be made, mitigation, adaptation to real climate change being experienced now, but also beyond that, to ensure that the growth trajectories that that countries were on are not now derailed altogether, with the consequence being heightened increased inequality.
Thanks, Yvonne. Travis, so this 500 billion that you've got, I know a lot of the funding that poor countries are relying on to do all the things they need to do, or often need to be government grants and things like that. But is any of your money, is there any possibility of it helping out Yvonne there? Are there investments that could help there? And I also just wanted to ask about binding commitments. A lot of these net zero things are voluntary. How is binding possible? I know you said that there might be some emerging binding commitments. And how do you avoid, when one firm does a net zero pledge, just shifting the bad stuff over to another part of the finance ecosystem?
Sure. Yeah, a lot to cover. I'll try to cover it fast.
I know, and briefly, too, since we're running out of time.
Yeah. So to cover it relatively quickly, yes, CalPERS, $500 billion is invested globally. So, we are, playing a part in investing in thousands of different companies across the world. But at the same time, I think it's also important to both identify, that adaptation as well as investments into climate solutions are both going to be vital. And I think you've even seen that over at different organizations, even Adrian's, with the climate pledge. With the billions of dollars of capital that are actually going into those type of climate solutions, which will lower the cost basis for all of us. And we'll be able to deploy more capital once that there's a levelized cost of more renewable energy or low carbon solutions that all will be able to benefit from. As far as this idea of shifting emissions, that's very much true. When I did speak about from an asset allocation type of perspective, I think that's also holding true. But from a company perspective, it definitely holds true as well. I think that saying that I said of you can run but you can't hide, it holds true both from the company perspective as far as the spectrum of where emissions actually fall and to what user it actually falls on. So ultimately, you're not going to see a significant amount of progress, that last 50% really mitigated until you have the entire supply chain and also the end consumer both incentivized to be able to reduce emissions consumption. That's going to be difficult, but there are certain things that we can actually do to be able to move the needle. Perhaps we'll be able to tackle that in the remaining 10 minutes when we come around for another question. But as far as what companies can do, I think something I'll leave just 2 points that are frankly exciting from an investor perspective. Is the idea that hundreds of different shareholder proposals are filed every single year. The SEC has now provided a legal bulletin just this last month and saying that targets and timelines for companies will now be allowed for the most part, as long as it still affords discretion for management on how to actually achieve such goals. It's a little bit different from how ordinary business was defined beforehand, where more shareholder proposals were thrown out. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, the international sustainability standards boards, as well as the SEC, have both stated that they're going to be coming out with guidance on ESG disclosure, which should include climate disclosure as well. The big aspect for those type of initiatives are going to be not only what is the ESG disclosure, but also where is it required. Both of those segments, as far as regulation of the disclosure, as well as the shareholder proposals, are both levers that are going to be playing into the effect of bringing things that are softer in their commitments to something that is much more firm. And when you actually bring it into financial type of disclosures, when you bring it into regulatory filings, all of a sudden now there's much more of an obligation and a legal commitment for companies to actually abide by whatever type of goals, whatever type of targets, whatever type of strategy they're actually laying out. The further you get away from that, that's going to obviously open up different type of legal concerns for companies, primarily in the U.S., but then to a certain degree also throughout other legal frameworks that we see across the world. So those are two exciting things that are happening, which will firm up a lot of these type of commitments that you'll see going forward.
Thanks. I'm keenly aware we have less than 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask you all a last question, and if you can possibly answer it, I know this is impossible, but if you can answer it in a minute or a minute and a half at the most, I would really appreciate it. And I think I'm going to make it kind of a general one, which is basically, we've talked about how much needs to be done. How do you do this fast enough and thoroughly enough? And I'm including things like these scope 3 emissions that are in supply chains and around the businesses that you do. How do we make this work fast enough and thoroughly enough that we really get to all the emissions down the supply chains and in the different regions? Mon, can you start on that one?
Yeah, thank you very much. And as mentioned, China is not just manufacturing for ourselves, it's also manufacturing for the entire world. So a lot of carbon has been generated during the process. Roughly about a quarter of them is actually for exporting. So, but this is also part of the carbon that we need to neutralize. We need to cut and neutralize in China. So it made a great opportunity for China and to work with other countries through the brands and with the investors based on the market. So, but they need data. I think we talk about the data can help to create accountability system. It also can help generate solutions, innovative solutions. Now, at this moment, there are roughly 100 global brands, including Amazon. I appreciate Adrian's company's efforts to tap into our data. More than 2.1 million records of violations. They tap into that before they sign contract and compare their list of suppliers with our list of violators and identify them and go through this process to validate and through disclosure, through third-party audit to try to resolve the problem. So far, more than 16,000 suppliers have gone through the process to improve their performance. And now, the new development is to develop digital solutions based on data to help the suppliers easily measure and disclose based on, not consultant on their side, but through the big data system mechanism, measure and disclose and digitize the science-based target setting process, and then identify the cost benefit, doing the cost benefit analysis also in a more digital way. So this is to reduce the cost and to make it more effective in supply chain management. Of course, we're very happy to see some of the largest investors, the banks in China, tap into the data. Now, the largest in the world and also the Postal Bank of China have tapped into this and started pilot using our digital accounting platform to drive their scope 3, those who want to borrow money from them, to measure and to disclose. So I think this is extremely important. And we just set up this a global map for brands and just highlight all the commitment made, including Amazon's commitment. I notice it doesn't still very much doesn't have a scope 3 target there. So I hope Amazon could also tap into this, because scope 3 absolutely to many brands it's the lion's share of their carbon footprint. Thank you.
Adrian, that sounds like a direct challenge. Are you thinking about your scope 3 emissions, those emissions that are outside your direct operations? Are we likely to see those included soon? And how do you scale up all these things fast enough?
No, we do include Scope 3 supply chain in our pledge, and we do report and measure on that. And we obviously sit in the middle of many global supply chains. We're a manufacturer, retailer, and cloud computing provider around the world. So we're measuring it. So there's an ongoing process to measure our supply chains, and obviously you can do it using an economic model. Say we spent the money here and come up with sort of rough guesses for what the carbon footprint is, but we're getting more and more detailed measurement into our supply chains, and that is a challenging thing. There's a lot of the supply chains just aren't instrumented. A lot of manual paper work kind of things that we're turning into things that we can do more directly. Couple of things here. One is that the cloud computing side of things was $60 billion business growing at 39%. And every time we move data center workloads to the cloud, we save roughly 90% of the carbon footprint. It's different depending on where you are in the world, but we have some reports showing roughly that kind of improvement. So that's one area. And then the other thing that's more customer visible is climate pledge friendly. And if you go onto the Amazon site and start searching for things, there's a tick box you can tick that basically says, I just want to look for climate pledge friendly products. We're really trying to drive more consumer awareness. We're getting more products signed up into this program. And that's going to be one of the ways that we create consumer demand for products across all kinds of categories, both consumables like soaps and things like that, but also electronics and all kinds of, we really want to have this across our entire product line, all the product lines that are available. But actually getting to the point where the people, the third-party sellers selling on our site need to understand the carbon footprint of the things they're selling. A lot of work going on here. We're putting a big chunk of work that our science team is working on is figuring out ways to do that and mechanisms we can use to help our supply chains, both upstream and downstream, to be more able to measure what they're doing so that we can report accurately on it and drive the climate pledge down to net zero, including all the Scope 3.
So it's a big challenge with all that many suppliers and so on. But you're going to get Scope 3 included in the pledge, and
it's a huge amount of work. We have many teams working on lots of different aspects of it. So this is, like I said, it's included in the pledge, and but it's definitely a work in progress.
Okay, thanks. Yvonne, speed and scale are words that you surely are thinking about a lot too, not least because this money is not coming through to do all the things that you promised and that you want to do for people. How do we speed it up? Do you see anything promising happening? How do we make this happen fast enough?
I think in our context, the nature-based solutions, providing that opportunity for growing a carbon sink, being a place, like I said, we're planting 1 million trees now. We want to keep that going and continue. That's of benefit to us as we fight the climate change consequences, whilst also providing this carbon sink. So this is an opportunity for those who are also looking for how do they get to net zero. Part of that equation for corporates, for private investors, could be working with us. So collaboration and really sort of like rounding the circle, so that also, because this also creates jobs, it also is part of a growth trajectory. So I would end on that note.
Okay, thanks so much. And thank you for being brief. And Travis, we've got 1 minute. Tell me, I know it's a challenge. How do you get this scale and speed that's needed? You're moving money. How do we get everybody to do that?
Yeah, as big as we are, we're still relatively small compared to the greater financial markets and the power that we're really seeing. But ultimately, to be able to move at scale and speed, which are a little bit sometimes contradictory, you're going to need policy intervention. You're going to need two things, really, in my opinion. You're going to see a meaningful price on carbon across, starting at least in all developed markets, and then hopefully, all markets, eventually. The other one is going to be carbon tariffs, most likely from a sectoral type of basis, to be able to equalize and normalize the differences from manufacturing that you might see from one geography to another. Basic example of each, consumer preferences, consumer changes, behavior are all going to be affected by price on carbon, which is going to be changing scope 3 emissions largely. That's great to hear what Amazon is doing. Think about the amount of calories that are in our food. We'll think about the amount of emissions that are also going to be tremendous work. The other aspect on carbon tariffs, think about, okay, a ton of steel that's produced in the US, let's say, from an electric arc furnace compared to what's produced maybe over in China. There might be some type of normalization that'll eventually take place where it says, okay, well, there has to be some type of fee or a tariff assessed because of the emissions profile that are required to be able to produce that from a different type of electricity or energy source. And that'll provide some type of normalization eventually. So those two things will be able to actually move in a meaningful way the emissions profile.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, I think that's what it's about, isn't it? The real price on these emissions and knowing what it is so you can choose it, like you choose the right kind of calorie content in your food, and making sure the price is the real one that takes into account the damage and the real things going on in the world as a result of all these products and investment and so on. Thank you all for really, really interesting comments throughout this. I appreciate your time, and thank you. We're out of time. We'll move on. Thank you again.